It was a night like any other in early autumn when I first discovered that being alone in your own home could be anything but safe. I had just moved into a modest old house on the outskirts of town. A fixer-upper I thought I could manage with some elbow grease and determination. The previous owners had left behind a legacy of memories, some pleasant, but others that whispered of past disturbances. I didn't pay them any heed back then. I was driven by the excitement of new beginnings. However, that night, as the wind howled outside and the trees scratched at the window panes, I realized that some beginnings could be haunted by more than just memories. I had spent the day unpacking and setting up a temporary workspace in the spare room. By dusk, I was alone in the creaking silence of the house, trying to piece together the history of my new home, from scattered documents and old photos I found tucked away in drawers. The house's layout was peculiar. Narrow hallways that led to unexpected rooms, and a staircase that creaked with every step, as if it were whispering warnings in a language older than time itself. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the eyes of the past were fixed on me. I'd brush it off as paranoia until the events of that fateful night unfolded. After a simple dinner in the kitchen, I retired to the living room with a book in hand. The house was a cocoon of solitude. The subtle creaks of the old wood and the sighing winds melded into the background, a soft hum that I found oddly comforting at first. Then, around midnight, a chill ran down my spine as I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the second floor. I lived alone, without any family or roommates, and the house was supposed to be locked up tight. I set my book aside and listened intently. The footsteps seemed to be deliberate, measured, like someone who was silently pacing the corridor. Unable to shake the dread that had suddenly gripped me, I rose and grabbed the nearest flashlight. I walked upstairs slowly, each step measured, the ancient wood groaning underfoot, as if protesting my intrusion into the past. The corridor was dark, lined with closed doors, some with layers of peeling wallpaper that gave the impression of faded secrets. I paused at the door of the master bedroom, where the footsteps had seemed loudest. The door was slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open and shone my flashlight inside. Empty. Nothing but the vestiges of disarray from previous tenants. An overturned lamp, a few scattered books, a blanket draped over a chair. I waited, heart pounding, listening for any sign of movement or life. The silence returned with a vengeance, thick and heavy. I couldn't have known that this was only the beginning of a night full of inexplicable occurrences. Downstairs in the kitchen, I heard a soft tapping on the window, a sound that was distinctly rhythmic, as though someone or something was trying to get my attention from the darkness outside. I crept back downstairs and peered out of the window into the shadowed backyard. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds and the trees swayed in the brisk night wind. There was nothing visibly amiss. The tapping continued, almost impatiently. I pulled back and turned away, my mind racing with questions. Was it a branch or something else entirely? I told myself to calm down, to rationalize. Old houses were known for picking up stray sounds that often led to wild imaginings. I decided to secure myself in the living room and lock the doors. I sat in a defensive posture, the flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I kept hearing soft rustlings and subtle creaks, like whispers too delicate for conversation. At one point, while scrolling through my phone, a text message notification flashed across the screen. It was from an unknown number and simply read, "You're not alone." My blood froze. It wasn't possible. Who could know I was home alone? I responded with nothing, paralyzed by fear. The phone screen remained lit, displaying that same chilling message as if it were a final farewell. Attempting to piece together a plan, I ventured towards the source of the sound once more. This time I followed the faint odor of old cedar that seemed to lead towards the attic, a place I had intended to clean out the following weekend. With each step up the narrow staircase to the attic door, my pulse throbbed in my ears. The attic door itself was old and rusted, its surface marred by small scratches and even deeper gouges, as if someone had been trying to claw their way out. Summoning a burst of courage, I gripped the cold handle, opened the door just a crack, and peered into the darkness beyond. The only light came from the weak beam of my flashlight cutting through decades of dust. The attic was filled with abandoned items, old trunks, broken furniture, and relics of a bygone era. But as I scanned the room, a sudden movement caused me to freeze. There, In the far corner, a shape crouched near a stack of boxes. I thought I saw eyes glimmer briefly before it melted into the dark. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light or if something truly was lurking there. I called out, my voice barely a whisper. "Hello? Is someone there?" The only response was the echo of my own words bouncing off the beams and forgotten memories. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, yet I stood rooted in place as a subtle, almost imperceptible voice murmured behind me. "Don't go. Stay with me." It wasn't a clear voice, but a slithering sound that seemed to seep from the very walls. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight dancing wildly as I swept the room. There was nothing. No one. My heart hammered louder, and I realized that I had locked myself inside a nightmare crafted not by a killer or a thief, but by something older and inexplicable. Desperate for any semblance of rationality, I stumbled back downstairs to the safety of the living room. I locked the attic door and buried my face in my hands. The terror had transformed the familiar confines of my home into a labyrinth of dread. I recalled local legends about the house, tales of a previous owner who had vanished under mysterious circumstances, and whispers of tragic events that left marks on the structure itself. I'd always dismissed such superstitions as mere folklore, until the surreal events of that night began to blur the lines between myth and reality. As the night deepened, I thought I might have found some comfort in the reappearance of normalcy when I set up my laptop to document the evening's events. I typed erratically, recounting every moment, every sound, every inexplicable chill that crawled along my spine. The text on the screen served as a reminder that these events were happening in real time, and they were not confined to the realm of my imagination. My typing was interrupted intermittently by knocks that originated from outside the house, soft, rhythmic knocks that measured time, as though someone were counting down to a destined moment. It was around 3:00 a.m. when a series of knocks came closer together, almost as if the source was right outside the front door. I mustered a trembling courage and crept to the door, peeking through the peephole. I saw nothing but the swirling mists of an autumn night. When I unlatched the bolt and slowly opened the door, a frigid gust of wind greeted me, carrying with it a murmur of voices. I couldn't tell what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakably pleading, as if they were warning me, begging me to leave before something irreversible occurred. The door shut behind me with a final, echoing thunk. I backed away, heart pounding, and returned to the living room to fortify the locks. The knocks ceased, but the unease remained. I attempted to convince myself that an overactive imagination was at fault, a leftover effect of the newness of the house. However, at that moment, the overhead light in the hallway flickered and then went out, plunging the corridor into darkness. The only illumination came from the erratic beam of my flashlight as I approached the hallway, uncertain what I might confront. Every step in the dark felt like traversing a minefield of past tragedies. I noticed, almost imperceptibly, a message scrawled in what looked like soot on one of the walls. "Stay here, you belong." The words were not written with any logic, yet they resonated with a profound sadness, as if someone had bled their despair onto the very wall for all eternity. My rational mind stuttered, unable to reconcile the beauty of the script with its underlying menace. Fear and pity warred within me as I tried to piece together whether this was the desperate act of a ghost, a warning, or something else entirely. Time lost meaning that night. Every minute stretched into an eternity of psychological torment. I found myself bolting from room to room, seeking refuge in the safety of numbers, the locks of my doors, the count of my belongings, anything to remind me that I was still in control. But the presence that haunted the house was elusive, a shadow that crept silently at the edges of every memory I held. The whispering voice returned in moments of dead silence. A soft, almost imperceptible susurration that laced itself through the quiet, coaxing me to surrender to the unease. In the early hours of dawn, as the first light of day struggled to break through the layers of despair, I sat slumped on the living room couch. I was physically drained and emotionally shattered. My laptop screen still glowed faintly with my frantic notes. I tried to recall every detail, every fleeting glimpse of the inexplicable, anything that could make sense of my terror. I had no concrete answers, only a mounting sense of dread and the shattering realization that my home had become a silent stage for a disturbing presence that would not let me go. When I finally gathered enough nerve to check the old family photo albums scattered on a side table, I found something even more disturbing. An old sepia-toned photograph of a smiling couple standing in the very same living room, with eyes that seemed to follow me from the faded edges of the picture. On the back of the photo, a handwritten note in spidery letters read, "They never left." My heart sank as I realized that the house was not a mere building, but a keeper of echoes from lives lost and secrets that should have remained buried. I spent the rest of that day meticulously documenting everything I had experienced, consulting with local historians and sifting through archived newspaper articles. A pattern emerged, a series of unexplained disappearances, whispers of unresolved tragedies, and a legacy of sorrow that clung to the bricks of my home. A local librarian confirmed that decades ago, several residents had vanished without a trace, leaving behind unanswered questions and a lingering presence that the community whispered about in hushed tones. I was now the latest chapter in a long, unnerving history. It wasn't until weeks later that I found the courage to invite a close friend over, hoping that his rational presence could dispel the dark memories of that night. Together, we re-watched security camera footage I had installed after my unsettling experiences. The grainy video showed nothing overtly sinister, yet in one particular frame captured in the attic, a fleeting, indistinct shadow passed across the background. There, amidst cobwebs and long-forgotten memories, something had moved on its own. My friend's skeptical frown deepened as he said, "There's no logical explanation for that." I couldn't argue with his words. My footage, my life, was now laced with the undeniable truth that my home was haunted by forces beyond explanation. That first night changed everything for me. I no longer viewed solitude as peace, but as a potential prelude to unspeakable horror. My once beloved sanctuary had become a battleground for restless spirits, and every creak, every whispered murmur served as a stark reminder that I was not, and perhaps would never be, truly alone. Even now, years later, when I return to that house, my heart quickens at the memory of the whispered voices, the quiet knock at the door in the dead of night, and the echoing message that I was forever a part of its haunting legacy. This story isn't just a recount of terror. It's a testament to how the past can intrude upon the present, revealing that sometimes the most unnerving horrors lie not in the physical realm, but in the echoes of lives once lived, waiting, unseen, for their moment to return. In the silence of our homes, we may find that we are never truly alone. The shadows linger and the whispers, once begun, are impossible to forget. It began as a seemingly ordinary evening. I had settled into a new routine since moving into an old family home I inherited from a distant relative. The house was a Victorian relic with character, ornate ceilings, winding hallways, and antique furniture that carried whispers of bygone eras. I was no stranger to ghost stories, but living in a house with such history made the paranormal feel almost inevitable. Still, I insisted that any stories I'd heard over the years were mere folklore meant to entertain rather than foretell reality. That night, however, I would learn that legends have a way of manifesting when you least expect them. My day had been spent rummaging through dusty boxes in the attic, sorting through relics my great-aunt had left behind, old photographs, yellowed letters, and a collection of antique mirrors. All of them spoke of the opulent yet mysterious life once led in this home. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house's soul was etched into every crevice, every antiquated item. By the time dusk fell, I had prepared a modest dinner and settled into my favorite armchair in the parlor, planning to review the letters and perhaps uncover hidden family secrets. As twilight deepened, the mansion took on a new personality. The warm glow of the setting sun gave way to long, creeping shadows that clung to the walls. Even the air felt heavier, almost as if I were breathing in the weight of ages past. I remember distinctly how the sounds of the evening seemed to orchestrate a quiet symphony of creaks, sighs, and the gentle whisper of wind through the old window frames. I turned my attention back to one of the letters, written in a flowing script that read like a love letter to a lost era. The words, however, were punctuated by strange symbols and cryptic notations, as if the writer intended to remind future generations of a secret too terrible to speak aloud. Around 10:30 p.m., after a few hours of reading, I began to notice subtle disturbances in the house. At first, it was merely the feeling of being watched, a prickling along the back of my neck that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to ignore it, attributing it to my overactive imagination fueled by old letters and the house's history. But soon, the sensation intensified into undeniable evidence. The antique mirror hanging in the hallway, a beautifully framed relic with an intricately carved frame, seemed to reflect more than my solitary figure. I could swear that when I passed by, the reflection flickered and shifted, momentarily revealing a figure standing just behind me. I spun around quickly, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Only the empty corridor lined with faded wallpaper and portraits of stoic ancestors, whose painted eyes seemed to follow my every move. As the clock's ticking deepened the silence of the night, I tried to resume my reading, though my concentration was shattered. Then came an odd noise, an almost imperceptible creak, like the slow opening of a door somewhere at the back of the house. I rose to investigate, each step measured and cautious. The sound seemed to be coming from the corridor that led to the guest room on the second floor, a room that had remained vacant for as long as I'd lived there. The air grew colder and denser as I climbed the creaking steps, my flashlight beam dancing nervously across the wall panels that had seen better days. Reaching the guest room, I noticed that the door was ajar. A soft luminescence spilled out into the hall, betraying the cool, shifting shadows inside. With a mix of trepidation and a desperate need for answers, I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The room was empty, except for the bed draped in an antiquated quilt and a large, ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. The mirror was identical in style to the one downstairs that had startled me moments before. I could not shake the feeling that it was watching me, its reflective surface holding secrets I was unprepared to face. As I studied the mirror, I was struck by an overwhelming sense of foreboding. The glass, mottled with age, seemed to pulse with an inner light. I leaned closer, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't quite explain, and that's when it happened. A distortion, as if the mirror rippled like the surface of a disturbed pond. For a moment, a shape emerged behind my reflection, a dark silhouette that hovered over my shoulder. I jerked upright, nearly toppling over in fright. Yet, when I turned, the room was empty. My heart hammered as I backed out of the room, convinced that I wasn't alone. Returning to the living room, I attempted to regain a semblance of normalcy. I locked the guest room door and sat before my old desk, desperately trying to justify what I'd seen. "It's just a trick of the light," I reassured myself. But deep down, a gnawing fear took root. I decided to document the incident in my journal, hoping that writing it down might dissipate the dread. Hours passed, and the uneasy silence of the house was intermittently broken by the distant sound of soft tapping and the occasional whisper that I could hardly decipher. Just past midnight, as I was revisiting the letter from my great aunt, the lights flickered wildly before plunging the entire house into darkness. I fumbled for my phone to use its flashlight, my hands trembling as I navigated the darkened hallways. The only sound in the darkness was the echo of my footsteps and a persistent, gentle tapping that seemed to come from every direction at once. The rhythm of the tapping was uneven, punctuated by long, silent pauses that amplified the eerie quiet. I felt an urge to leave, to escape the growing dread. But I knew that my home was now a maze of dark corridors that concealed more than just the furnishings from another century. Unable to sleep and desperate for rational explanations, I decided to investigate the source of the tapping once more. I followed the sound to the entryway of the house, where a heavy oak door stood slightly open, a door that I distinctly remembered locking before bed. Pushing it open, I was hit with a blast of cold, damp air that carried the scent of decaying leaves and earth. The area beyond was shrouded in darkness, illuminated only by the pale glow of the moon slicing through intermittently drifting clouds. Outside, the garden was overgrown and wild, as though nature itself was reclaiming what man had abandoned decades ago. I stepped out onto the porch, my phone's light trembling in my grip. The tapping had ceased. Instead, a figure was silhouetted against the moonlit landscape, an indistinct shape standing motionless near the garden gate. For a few agonizing seconds, we simply regarded each other from a distance. The figure's presence was both unnerving and pitiful, its outline blurred by the interplay of shadows and light. I couldn't see any details, no face, no clothing that would reveal its nature. All I felt was a profound sadness emanating from it, as if it were the lingering remnant of a tormented soul, forever trapped between two worlds. I called out, "Hello? Who's there?" My voice was small and uncertain, swallowed by the vast silence of the night. The figure did not move or respond. It merely stood there, its stillness a testament to centuries of waiting. Then, as if spurred by my call, it began to move slowly toward the gate. My instincts overpowered my curiosity, and I hurried back into the house, bolting the door behind me. I sank onto the floor, my heart pounding as I tried to recall every moment, every detail. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this apparition trying to communicate a message? Had it followed me indoors? I couldn't be sure. For the rest of the night, I huddled in the living room. Every creak, every muffled sound sparked terror, as if the house itself were alive and aware of my every thought. The oppressive silence was punctuated by soft murmurs I could barely make out. At times, I thought I could hear a conversation, snippets of voices caught in the draft of the old walls. The voices seemed to carry a tone of regret and sorrow, and as I strained to decipher them, a particular phrase echoed repeatedly, "Don't forget." It was whispered in the throes of despair, a reminder of someone's unfulfilled promise or unavenged wrong, a secret tied to the very fabric of the home. In the early hours before dawn, sleep came in fragmented fits of restless naps. In my dreams, I saw glimpses of the past, a lavish ball in the grand parlor, the elegant swirl of gowns and the soft laughter of guests, abruptly interrupted by a sudden tragedy. Faces contorted in grief, eyes reflecting terror that transcended time, and there, in the midst of it all, was the spectral figure from the garden, its eyes heavy with sorrow. I awoke with tears streaming down my face, a dream that left as many questions as it had answers. Determined to find some semblance of truth, I embarked on a quest the following morning to research the history of the house. In a small-town library, I pored over archived records and old newspapers. What I uncovered was chilling. The property had once belonged to a wealthy family whose fortune had been marred by a series of unexplained tragedies. One particularly harrowing event recounted an unsolved disappearance, a maid who vanished without a trace after claiming that she had seen a shadow with pleading eyes wandering the halls at night. Her disappearance was never resolved, and those with the faintest belief in the supernatural speculated that her spirit, along with others, might have been condemned to wander the estate, trying desperately to be remembered. Armed with this historical context, I returned home with mixed emotions, a sense of inevitability and an almost paternal desire to offer solace to the lingering spirits. In the days that followed, I found evidence of the past in the most unlikely of places. Whispered voices that now seemed less menacing and more mournful, reflections that appeared in mirrors as if to plead for recognition, and the persistent sense that I was not alone, but rather burdened with the task of remembering the tragic history that had unfolded within these walls. I began to engage with the house's secrets rather than fear them. I set up an old audio recorder near the guest room mirror and documented the faint phrases that drifted through the silence. Words like "forgive us" and "don't forget" that resonated with the sorrow of lost souls. Each night, I listened to the recordings, amazed and haunted by the clarity with which the voices expressed their longing for closure. I even placed a small bouquet of fresh flowers on the windowsill of the guest room, a silent gesture of reconciliation. Whether it was recognized by the unseen presences or not, I wanted to show that their memories mattered. Yet even as I sought to reach out with compassion, the phenomena did not cease. On a particularly stormy night a week later, when thunder boomed like the wrath of ancient gods and lightning etched jagged scars across the sky, I experienced a final, terrifying encounter. I was in the kitchen preparing a late-night snack when the overhead light flickered violently and then died completely, leaving the room in profound darkness. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor leading to the dining room, a sound too deliberate to be the wind. I froze, holding my breath as the footsteps approached. The tension was so thick I could taste it, and in that charged moment, I was convinced the mysterious visitor had come home once more. Summoning every ounce of resolve, I clutched my phone and crept down the hall, the beam of its flashlight trembling like a last bastion of hope in the oppressive darkness. There, in the doorway of the dining room, stood the spectral figure from the previous night. Its features were now slightly more distinct, a face marked by unspeakable grief, eyes that seemed to brim with unshed tears, and a presence that radiated a silent plea for acknowledgement. For what felt like an eternity, we regarded one another in silence. I wanted to speak, to ask its name or beg for some sign of its tragic tale, but the words died on my lips. Instead, I simply bowed my head in respect and whispered, "I remember." In that single phrase, a tide of unspoken sorrow passed between us. The figure slowly receded, its expression softening into one of quiet resignation. The footsteps faded into nothingness, and the oppressive energy that had gripped the house seemed to lift ever so slightly. I knew then that the haunting was not an act of vengeance, but a cry for remembrance, a reminder that the lives that once filled this grand home deserved to be honored, not forgotten. Although the phenomenon diminished in frequency, the house never truly returned to the warm embrace of normalcy. Each night, as I sat alone in the dim lamplight of the parlor, I could still detect those soft murmurs and feel the lingering presence of the midnight visitor. I continued to document every unusual occurrence, every subtle shift in the ambiance of the home, as if weaving together a tapestry of memory, loss, and hope. The experience transformed my understanding of solitude. It was no longer merely a state of being alone, but a dialogue with the past and with souls that yearned to be remembered. The midnight visitor had left an indelible mark on my life. I had entered the home to claim it as mine, to forge a future steeped in my own dreams, and instead, I inherited a legacy of stories that transcended time. I came to believe that our homes are not just shelters, but sanctuaries of memory, places where echoes of love, grief, and mystery coexist long after the voices of the living have faded. In that transformative realization, I found solace, not only in honoring the spectral inhabitants, but also in understanding that every creak of the floorboard, every flicker of a dying light, was an invitation to remember the stories that built the very walls around me. Today, whenever I hear the soft tapping on a window or notice the way a mirror's surface seems to ripple in the quiet, I don't feel terror. Instead, I feel a profound connection to those who came before me, a bond forged by time, loss, and the enduring power of memory. The story of the midnight visitor serves as a constant reminder that even when you are utterly alone, you may share your space with echoes of the past, urging you to never forget the lives and tragedies that have shaped the very essence of your home. The house had always been a place of mystery and contradictions, a proud, stately structure that bore the weight of years and whispered secrets that seeped through every crack in its foundation. After moving in, I couldn't shake the feeling that this grand domicile was hiding a darker side, one that I was destined to encounter alone. I had heard neighbors mention odd sounds late at night and seen unexplained flickers of movement through the windows, but I dismissed them as exaggerations. Never did I imagine that one particular night would force me to confront the chilling echoes of the past emanating from deep within the basement. It began on a rainy evening, the kind where the sky wept endlessly and the steady drum of raindrops masked even the faintest disturbances. I had spent the day exploring the house, a sprawling three-story manor inherited from a relative whose name was now just a faded ink on a lineage tree. While most rooms exuded elegance, there was one space I had largely ignored: the basement. It was a vast, cavernous area hidden beneath layers of dust and memories. My curiosity was piqued, but a nagging dread told me it was best left undisturbed. That night, however, fate pushed me toward its depths. After a simple dinner and a few hours spent sorting through a collection of old letters and records, I began to feel an inexplicable restlessness. The storm outside intensified, and the house was alive with sound. The sigh of the wind, the creak of settling timbers, and an occasional, almost inaudible thump from below. At first, I convinced myself that the sounds were nothing more than the natural groans of an aging building. But as midnight passed, a peculiar sound grew louder. A steady, rhythmic echo, like someone or something pacing deliberately in a confined space. My pulse quickened with each reverberating footstep. I tried to ignore it, burying myself in the faded pages of a family Bible. But the sound clawed its way into my thoughts. Finally, I could no longer dismiss it as mere figments of an overactive imagination. With a mixture of trepidation and determination, I grabbed a heavy flashlight, crossed the parlor, and headed straight for the basement door. The door itself was ancient, with a robust iron handle that had long been cold to the touch. I hesitated a moment, wondering if some force was warning me to stay away, but I pressed on. I opened the door slowly, and a sudden draft of cold, musty air wafted out, carrying with it an aroma of damp earth and something older, something almost metallic. Descending the creaky steps, I felt as if I were entering a different realm. The basement was vast, its darkness punctuated only by the erratic beam of my flashlight. The sound of my footsteps ricocheted off the exposed brick walls and low ceiling, joining in the chorus of strange echoes. As I moved further in, the rhythmic sound became unmistakable. Someone pacing back and forth, their footsteps echoing in a maddening loop. Deep in the bowels of the basement, I discovered an old storage room filled with relics of decades past. Dust-laden furniture, broken porcelain, and trunks bursting with yellowed documents lay scattered about, resembling the remnants of a forgotten era. Amid these relics stood an ornate mirror, its surface tarnished and encased in an intricately carved frame. I paused, transfixed by the mirror's reflection, which shimmered unnervingly in the weak light. For a brief moment, it seemed to capture not only my reflection, but also a shadowy figure standing directly behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone lurking in the darkness, but there was nothing, only the pervasive gloom and silence of the basement. The sensation of being watched sank in, and I began to wonder if I was intruding on a presence that belonged to another time. Compelled by equal measures of fear and fascination, I moved closer to the mirror. As my eyes adjusted to the dim illumination, I noticed that the glass reflected more than just the room. It seemed to show a glimpse of the past. Faded images of people milling about, engaged in muted conversation, appeared as ghostly overlays on the backdrop of my modern intruder. In one fleeting vision, I saw a young girl in a vintage dress, her eyes wide with terror as she darted past the mirror in silent desperation. In another, a man in an old-fashioned suit lingered near a doorway, his expression heavy with regret. These spectral scenes blended into a disturbing tableau of lost lives and unresolved anguish. My heartbeat quickened as I struggled to make sense of it all. Were these mere tricks of my imagination, or was the mirror acting as a portal to the past? The steady echo of pacing footsteps persisted throughout the basement, and I felt an almost magnetic pull drawing me deeper into its labyrinthine corridors. I began to trace the sound to a narrow passage leading off the main storage area. There, the air was even colder, and the walls were lined with rusty pipes that dripped sporadically, creating a discordant melody with the echoing steps. The passage eventually opened into a small chamber that appeared to serve as a utility room. In the center of the room was a single ancient rocking chair, its wood worn smooth by the passage of time. The chair rocked gently back and forth on its own, as if animated by an unseen force, each creak synchronizing with the pacing echoes from beyond. I reached out to touch the chair, half expecting my fingers to pass through it like mist. The wood was surprisingly solid and bore a warmth that contrasted with the icy air around it. Just as I made contact, the rocking stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was oppressive, laden with a sense of foreboding. Then, in the near distance, a soft, sorrowful humming began. An indistinct melody that resonated deep within the confines of the dark chamber. It was a tune I felt I had heard before, one that spoke of loss, longing, and an unfulfilled past. The combination of the echoing footsteps, the spectral mirror, and now the lullaby spun into a chorus of dread that left me frozen in place. I wondered whether the house was trying to communicate with me, or if I had unwittingly invaded a realm reserved for those long gone. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I struggled to reconcile the inexplicable with the rational. The basement, a place I had presumed to be nothing more than an archive of old belongings, had transformed into an eerie stage where the past reigned supreme. Every sound, every flicker of movement ignited my imagination with sinister possibilities. I clutched my flashlight tighter, its beam now a feeble barrier against the overwhelming darkness. Deciding that I had to leave, I turned back toward the staircase. But as I retraced my steps, I caught sight of something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A figure at the far end of the basement, partially obscured by shadows. It was impossible to tell if it was a man or a woman, but the figure exuded an aura of deep sorrow and regret. The eyes, though indistinct, seemed to meet mine in a silent plea for remembrance. I took a tentative step forward, my heart hammering in my chest, and the figure slowly faded into the darkness as if dissolving into the very air around us. The sensation left me both terrified and oddly compassionate. Who was this forlorn spirit, and what had bound it to this forsaken place? I decided that the echoes and apparitions demanded a deeper understanding. Over the following days, I began an exhaustive search into the history of the house and its enigmatic basement. I spent hours poring over public records, old newspapers, and personal letters donated by previous owners. A series of tragic events gradually unfolded before me. The manor had once been the site of a devastating family feud that culminated in a murder-suicide, leaving scars not only on the surviving relatives but on the very foundation of the home. One of the victims, a young woman, barely in her 20s, was reported to have been secluded in the basement after the incident. Neighbors recounted how, even long after the tragedy, mournful sounds and indecipherable voices could be heard coming from below. It appeared that the basement had absorbed the sorrow and guilt of the past, echoing the unresolved pain of those who suffered within its walls. Armed with these grim revelations, I began to see the basement not as a haunted repository, but as a silent memorial to lives cut short and regrets left unatoned. In a bid to give some form of closure to the lingering spirits, I decided to conduct a small, respectful memorial within that space. One chilly evening, after the storm had passed and the house felt subdued and introspective, I returned to the basement. I brought with me a bouquet of white lilies, a symbol of purity and remembrance, and placed them gently on a flat, dusty slab that appeared to have once held an altar of some sort. I sat for a long while in silence, speaking softly into the darkness, telling the long-forgotten souls that their stories mattered and that they were not doomed to be lost in the echoes of time. To my astonishment, the basement seemed to respond. The oppressive silence softened, and the rhythmic pacing of footsteps ceased. Instead, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, a sound that could have been interpreted as relief, as if the spirits recognized the gesture of compassion. I lingered for a few more minutes, feeling an inexplicable calm wash over me. In that hushed moment, I realized that the echoes in the basement were not there to terrorize me, but to remind me of a past that had been left unresolved. The house, with all its grandeur and its tragedies, was a vessel of memory, a repository of stories that demanded to be heard. Even as time passed and life resumed its normal rhythm, I found that the basement continued to influence my existence. The experience became a quiet, constant reminder that our homes hold more than just physical objects. They embody the essence of every laugh, every tear, every whispered secret that has ever lingered within their walls. The echoes in the basement were a part of that tapestry, a ghostly refrain interwoven with the very fabric of the house's history. I began to invite friends over for quiet evenings, subtly sharing my experiences and encouraging them to listen, to really listen, to the sounds of a home's past. In time, what had once been a source of terror evolved into a story of empathy and remembrance, as each of us began to consider that perhaps the paranormal was less about malevolence and more about the silent cries of a bygone era desperately seeking acknowledgement. The memory of that first night in the basement remains with me always, a relentless reminder that sometimes the most disturbing encounters are not the ones that try to harm us, but those that force us to confront the hidden sorrows of history. The spectral figure that I saw, the forlorn eyes that met mine, and the gentle lullaby echoing off cold stone have all become symbols of a time when pain was buried beneath the veneer of civility, when voices were stifled by grief. Now, Each time I pass the basement door, I am compelled to remember, to honor the lives that once made this house a home, to acknowledge that the echoes I once feared are in fact enduring testaments to the love and loss that shaped the generations before me. In sharing my story, I hope to invite others to look beyond the surface of isolation and solitude. True terror, I've learned, lies not in the unknown, but in the silence that follows a tragedy left unsaid. The basement, with its echoing footsteps and spectral reminiscences, taught me that every home has a history, sometimes dark and sometimes desperate, and that it is our responsibility to listen to those echoes, and perhaps in doing so, to heal the wounds that span across the ages.